All right, everybody. This is our the first episode of NEMPA Drivecast. So we are the New England Motor Press Association. I'm Craig Fitzgerald. I'm an automotive editor with DCR Marketing, and I've got two guests today. Actually, my co-host George Kennedy, who's
Howdy.
the NEMPA Vice President, and our guest this week is Cliff Atiyeh, who is our president, the boss. Somebody I've known for like what 20 something years now.
I think it has been. Yes.
It's crazy.
Years go by.
I know. You know, it's funny. Like I look at myself now on the camera and I'm like, I'm the old guy in the group. I used to be the young guy in the group. That is definitely not the case anymore. So the New England Motor Press Association, if you don't know, we are a group of journalists and content producers here in New England. And we produce content all over the country, right? We're contributors to places like Car Gurus, who I know both of you guys contribute to, and I have in the past. I work out of an office in Milwaukee. We have people doing things for Car and Driver and Road and Track. And so, Cliff, why don't you give us 2 seconds and kind of explain what we do as a group?
Well, NEMPA, like a lot of regional press associations, right? It's all about journalists, right? It's about building people up, keeping them working, and really a good group of people to network and just be friends with. And we do serve the automotive industry collectively. So all of the content, especially that you just said, Craig, is all essentially national. It's regional, it's national. And the combined efforts of 40 plus journalists in 6 states, we produce a lot of numbers. So it's I think it's very valuable. And the New England region, especially as we go on and on with this show, I hope everybody will know is that it's a very unique part of the country, and we know it, and the buyers truly better than anyone. That's what we're here to do.
Georgie, what about you? You've been, you know, you're kind of in the class that came in with Cliff. You know, I've been around long enough that, you know, as you know, Cliff alluded to, we kind of used to be a very regional organization where it was like, you know, John White at the Boston Globe, and it was, right, you know, right, whoever at the Christian Science Monitor. These were print publications. And now it's just exploded where we just cover things all over the place.
So yes, I also remember when you were one of the young guys. But yeah, no, you're right. I came on right around the same time as Cliff. So around 2007, 2008. That was an interesting time, not only because of the carpocalypse from the financial crisis, but also that was the start of the big transition, or was mid-transition from print to digital.
Right.
So for our entire careers, we had to kind of have a foot in both worlds. So Cliff and I were both at the Globe for a while, while also working for a number of different outlets. And that's been sort of the gist of my career. And like many other members of the New England Motor Press Association, you have folks that, yes, they're local. They might have some local outlets, and then there are even some local sort of spins on topics, but they're writing for national outlets. Right. And that's where sort of the group is kind of evolved into this powerhouse, in that you've got folks who are writing for U.S. News and World Report, for Car Gurus, for Forbes, for the New York Times, Hemmings Motor News. I mean, some of these are local, some of these are national, but this local group has a definite national footprint and international as well.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that the transition from print to digital, and when I think about it, like my first job in the industry and the thing that got me involved with the New England Motor Press Association was I was in 1999 I was on staff at a company called Automotive Information Center in Acton, Massachusetts at the time. And we were one of the first websites that was out producing content about cars. Like we beat like Kelly Blue Book to the punch online. They were still a print publication. And at that time, it was like I always felt like, you know, the people in the organization always respected me, and you know, but the general feeling among the industry, the automotive industry, was like, yeah, what's this internet thing? You know, who knows where that's going to go? And I've watched it shift in this last 25 years to like, if you don't have digital presence now, print
Well,
still matters, obviously.
And that
right?
goes without saying. It sounds obvious now, right? But like autos is always slow to everything, right?
Yeah.
Like you've worked with some outlets that have sort of dealings in the dealer world. I had a startup that, made ads for dealerships and agencies. So I saw firsthand just how in the dark ages dealers have been and a lot still are. And that comes a lot from the fact that you kind of need to go to them. So they, in a lot of ways, yes, during the pandemic, they kind of had to evolve a little bit. But like when if you want to talk about sort of, online car buying, it didn't take hold after the pandemic. So that stands to reason that like, if they don't have to change from that, then they really don't ever have to change. So
right.
they're always really slow on the uptick for new and emerging tech, regardless of what the product is. The actual industry and the mechanisms by which people buy cars is still pretty dated.
Cliff, what was your first gig in the industry?
Really, yeah, the Boston Globe, I would say, like here.
Yeah.
When I was a college student, I managed to get into some cars in London. I was interning with the Times, and I got to go to a Silverstone race out over there for F1. I had written a few small car stuff for like a local paper. So I started in print, studied journalism as a print journalist, wanted to be in a print magazine, right? But then just like George and you guys are saying, like, it's just clearly that, and the internet opened up that opportunity. So when I was at the Boston Globe, I was on the digital side, which
right. That was what I was hoping to get to, because I think that was where you and I really started to work together was, because the thing that propelled my career 22 years ago or something was I was filling in for John White on the weekends occasionally. Right. So it was a great thing. I got, a print piece in the Boston Globe on a Saturday or a Sunday, and it got me jobs everywhere. And then I left doing freelance stuff, went to work at Hemmings Motor News for 8 years or so, and came back, and you were the first person who talked to me. Literally, like, you were at Boston.com at the Boston Globe, and we're like, hey, would love to have you do some stuff.
And I know if you remember at that time that online we had like no budget, so I couldn't pay
you. That's right. I think you still owe me money, Cliff.
You and George, and we had Bill Griffith, and I had met all you guys. Like, oh, these guys are really talented. They know what they're doing. Like, I could essentially be in charge of the weekend section. Like, there was advertising people who were doing it technically, but they let me run the show, and then we got to say pretty much anything we wanted to, which was great. You did a piece, Craig, I remember, on like where did the small pickup truck go? And then here we are.
I still get feedback on that. That article was dedicated 12 years ago. Yeah, that was 12 years ago, and I still, is that how long ago it was? Must be, because it was like it was more than that. It was like 2011, because that was when Ford, backed away from the Ranger, thinking, I mean, obviously everybody's going to either drive an overpriced F-150 or they're going to buy a Transit Connect. That's going to serve the needs of the American consumer. And then, 12 years later, they're selling a Maverick like crazy because, the people still don't want to overpay for a pickup.
The Ranger costs like 40 grand.
Right? Yeah, right. Right. And so, that it's a good point. It was like that article was really timely and still gets some traction, oddly enough. I still find that article coming up from time to time. So, huge credit to you for asking me to do that. And it's been a lot of fun to work with both of you guys over the last decade and a half.
Yeah, Cliff got me my first gig with the Globe. I had been at Wheels TV initially. That was my first. I started as an intern there, and then kind of worked my way up through that company. And that was doing video production for dealerships and agencies. And I had met you guys because we needed to get cars to film. And so I started connecting with some of you folks. And that showed me sort of what NEMPA is all about, which is like it's a vetting process, right? By which, like, it's a one-to-one vetting process. There's nothing better than like human to human, interaction on that. And then, but once you're through that vetting process, if you're looking for something, if you're a working professional, we find people gigs. Like, I have a strong connection with the Lars Anderson Auto Museum, and we have an outlet called Upshift, and I try and get NEMPA members involved in that. Folks like Chris Teague and Cliff will be on the upcoming issue in the fall. But that very first Globe article, I think it was more like Cliff and I had only known each other for a little bit. He was kind of like, you kind of need an angle. And so I just happened to be at one at Wayne Carini Chasing Classic Cars, his facility, F40 Motorsport in Connecticut. They were having an open house that day. And I was either texting or emailing with Cliff on my phone being like, okay, if I can get a interview with Wayne Carini, how does that fly? And he's like, yes, do that. So I kind of shoved my way through the crowd and introduced myself. And I think I did an interview with him. We were sitting way off to the side in a mini moke, hanging out in one of those. Oh, no, I'm sorry, a Fiat Jolly.
Yeah,
we were sitting on the wicker chairs of a Fiat Jolly, getting that interview, and that was really cool. So I ended up, doing stuff with the Globe for a bit, and it was full circle because my grandmother was a typist for the Globe.
Oh, no kidding!
Working at the old location.
Yeah,
of the Globe. So I was able to show
3 Morrissey Boulevard. Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. The one even before, the older one. Yeah. So it was really cool to show them because my grandfather, my dad, and I all have the same name. So it's really cool to show them, their name in print at the Globe. That was a real cool moment.
Well, and it's cool too because that relationship with Wayne in our organization really came through you. I honestly didn't know where that relationship came from. So, it's interesting that, now he hosts our awards banquet and has for the last, almost 10 years, I guess. Where he keeps, so Wayne's a funny guy, so we do this thing every year, and we'll kind of get into why we do this. We do an award ceremony in the summer every year. And I don't know, about 10 years ago, John Lawler had asked Wayne Carini to host this thing for us. And he figured, I'm going to be, it's say a couple of words right up front. And I actually handed him a sheaf of papers, here's what you need to read. And it was like an hour worth of material, and it's he keeps coming back. So he must enjoy it in one way or another. But
I remember those times too, when Wayne couldn't pronounce all the names because
still can't.
And we just but he always made light of it. And then
it's great
getting to know him, who he is. It's he knows everyone.
He totally does.
It truly is a kind of cornerstone of what we do, because it's when we tell people, well, who's a NEMPA? Who's really there? It's us, it's Wayne, it's people like Mike Venn who are doing producing behind the scenes. It's all these people. And it's oh, there's a lot. And it's that's what we always tell people. It's show up because we're very busy. We're glad to be. And there's way more people in this region than I think we get credit for.
Well, and I think it shifted from somebody being busy at one job, like John White at the Boston Globe. That was his only thing. That was all he did. It was 2 columns a week. And he might have a front page story very occasionally when there was kind of more, general automotive news to report. But for the most part, it was two things a week. And now it's everybody's got 9 jobs, everybody's kind of hustling all over the place. And it's great to see. It's people are just really busy and really interested to do the work.
Well, and that's the thing I'm grateful for too, is that with I said, with Upshift, I try and get our guys and women placed. With Matt Smith at Car Gurus does an awesome job of really stepping up to bat for all the writers. The new project, and so I'm working on a pilot with them for a new type of content. It was written content, but just a new angle for them.
Yeah.
He fights to make sure that it's one of us that's going to go do that, because he knows us. He knows we're always going to say yes. We're always going to be on time. Our copy's going to be clean. And so that's really great to know that there are people doing that, and it goes around, comes around, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So actually we should talk about cars a little bit. We do, as an organization, we do kind of two big events a year. We do the official winter vehicle of New England, which is it's a judged competition that we award vehicles, in different categories. And we announce those, oddly enough, in the middle of the summer. But it's because our second event is the Ragtop Ramble, which we drive from the Museum of Transportation or the Lars Anderson Museum in Brookline, Massachusetts, and we drive up to Kennebunkport in Maine. And we get great support for that. We've been doing that event for 26 years, something like that.
Yeah, I think you guys agreed it was 1995 or thereabouts.
95. I think I missed the first year, and then I missed a few in the middle when I was at Hemmings, but most of them I've been there for. So we, for that event, we generate a lot of press for that, and we get a lot of cars here for that it originally started as a convertible top event when everybody had a convertible. There are fewer convertibles now, so the mix of vehicles is a little bit different, but it's still just a really great opportunity for a bunch of us to get in cars that we wouldn't normally. So
it's more like flashier cars now too.
Yes.
So if you have something that's like a hot rod version, so like a Cadillac, Blackwing or an AMG Mercedes, it's also a really good opportunity for, smaller upstart automakers. Like we had EMC, Expedition Motor Cars bring their Wolf, which was really, really cool. And that's something that
awesome.
They're not otherwise going to be able to get in front of that unless they go to like Pebble and do an activation there, and that costs them a ton of money to do.
Right.
It's going to be or Greenwich. It's going to be hard for them to go do an activation that's going to get them in front of the right eyeballs. Like, yes, you can go to some sort of private event, which is like you're going to have your clientele there, but in terms of press, it's going to be hard to beat other than coming to something like this where you've got 50 journalists there, all kind of looking at fun stuff. But it's new. This is something completely different. It's this retro G-Wagon 4x4, and now it gets to be in front of people. So I've already got coverage for that for Upshift. Other outlets, folks from other outlets have already looked at it. So a lot of eyeballs from just one day.
Yeah, right. So with those unique vehicles coming here, obviously that day, just because it's a long drive up there, we have a rest stop in between. You might get into two. I think I got into 3 cars that day. I drove the Supra. I drove that Wolf, which was amazing. And what was the other thing I drove? Oh, the Nissan Z. But the idea is those cars come here and then they spend the rest of the summer here so that the entire membership can kind of generate some content based around what they drove. So I'm going to ask you guys I'll start with Cliff. What were the 3 things that really stood out for you this year at the Ragtop?
For cars, right?
Yeah. You can talk about anything you want, but yeah, I'm primarily interested in cars. I don't care about people that much. So.
Well, we did have a golf putting championship, which I watched everyone partake in. So that was new this year. That was definitely highly competitive. And then I definitely was staring at the Rolls-Royce Spectre the whole time. That was very exciting to have them participate. We had and then also the Corvette E-Ray.
That's right. I forgot the E-Ray was there too.
And yeah, those cars kind of were my highlights. But truly, when you look at what our event is, it's like, oh, this is essentially a mini Concours d'Elegance.
Yeah.
So when we did it, every time Ragtop Ramble is typically right before Pebble Beach.
Right.
So it can be a little challenging sometimes to get some of the automakers to send their best cars, but we typically have them. And when I look at it, I'm like, on this lawn, we get that gorgeous carriage house in the back. Yeah. We're on the water. It's like, this is like a proper, like elegant event. And like, it's impressive. Like I've done it for so long now, but I'm still like, wow, every single time. That's my reaction.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Cliff, that's a good point, because that's what the original Concours d'Elegance was all about, was what is the latest, most beautiful, most interesting car in production at that time. They were really a modern car show. And, then it became, many years later after the 60s really became a vintage car event. But you're right. You're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about that. And, you know, the lawn at the Lars Anderson Museum, like, it's amazing. It's just the most beautiful piece of property, you know, in greater Boston, really.
Oh yeah.
It's fantastic.
You stand there and there's like, we were almost in a full circle, almost like
Yeah.
270 degrees of cars all around. And I was just like,
Yeah.
oh, you know, it's not everybody can pull that off. And I think we make everybody have a good time.
Right.
They already are having a good time, but it's a different type of event too, because I've been asked, well, how come we can't drive all the cars? It's like, well, just like you said, Craig, they're here for testing for later,
Right.
so we can do that. But that's not what it's about. It's not a free for all during that
Right.
day where I got to have this key, I got to take this from you. It's tempered down. It's more like a rally, and that's what I like about it, is that we're not all fighting for this key in that car. It's like,
no, that's a great point. And, you know, I've been to events, you know, we've all been to events at other places where literally, like, you've almost seen fistfights for, you know, placement in something really unique. And you really don't get that here.
It's like
and it's
like,
yeah,
everyone's waiting for the key on a McLaren or something like that, right?
Right. And you know, I've always felt like, you know, I don't know if you guys feel like this, but like, as being part of this organization, it's like, well, my job is to drive the Kia Rio as much as it is to drive a Rolls Royce. So, you know, as our friend John Lawler once said, you know, into every driveway a little Daewoo must fall. That was the absolute truth, you know, like, wow. Eventually you're going to get it, you know? And so, yeah, I wouldn't pick out anybody who still manufactures a car today, but that was the truth, man. So, you know, it's a great opportunity for all of us to get in these things. So, Georgie, what were your highlights this year?
Yeah, so the first car I drove that day at the Ragtop was a Lucid Air.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot that was there too.
And that was great because that was a car that I didn't like. These EV startups don't really come into the same press rotation. Like Tesla has made it well known that they don't really play ball with the press. They do their own thing. Yep. They go over to their press department. Fine. The only time I've ever been in a Tesla has been driving with like a friend's Tesla, right?
Right.
So I didn't expect to see a car like that there. And through, you know, some great connections being made, we were able to get a Lucid Air there. And what's cool was that I understood more about what that car is gunning for. It's not, yes, it's trying to take on the Tesla Model S Plaid. What it's really trying to do is trying to get somebody who is a Mercedes S-Class owner to be comfortable with making the transition to EV. Like it's going more for quality and comfort and all those things, and sort of being a one-to-one swap. Then later that day, I did drive the Wolf. Yep. I drove that, you know, later on. I think. Oh, and then I drove the Z. Yeah. And so that was fantastic. So no, I'm sorry, no, it wasn't the Z. It was the manual Supra.
Oh, that thing. Yeah. So that's interesting because that was one of my highlights too. I left the museum with that. Really enjoyed it because I think, if I remember correctly, I don't think I've driven one with a manual. That was a GR, so very cool car.
Yeah, and that the manual is a late addition to their product.
That's right.
Within the last like year or two.
Yeah, correct.
Because it's based on the BMW Z4 chassis, which didn't offer a manual, so they had to sort of work on that. And I bet it took some time because that was whenever they came out with that car originally, that was going to be one of the biggest asks, was a manual. Yep. So another thing I learned about that from talking to our friends at Toyota is that if you're familiar with any versions of the new Supra, if you open the window just a crack, the buffeting that you get, so a crack or all the way, like the air's not making its way all the way through the car. And so there's this crazy buffeting going on. Yeah. And I talked to our contacts at Toyota. I go, you know, you could just do it in a way that there's like a vent in the back or something, let the air through. He goes, look, we've tried it before. We did the wind tunnel testing, and in such a way that it would do that, our MPG would go up by like 3 or 4, believe it or not. So they offer like a $5 part on Amazon that you can put like attach it to the side mirrors that change the sort of the vortices of air.
Oh, no way.
We're letting that exist out there. We're not going to play with it because we need that CAFE regulation levels for MPG.
Right. That's really interesting because I did notice, because I tend to drive with the windows open, and that car is undrivable with the windows open. It really is. I mean, the Z's is, it's all right. It's not as bad, but man, that thing is crazy. So for me, it was that car. I did spend time in the Miata, the MX-5 RF with the hard. Oh, it's RF, right? With the hard top, RF, the retractable. Yep. And I hadn't driven a Miata in a long, long time. I owned one. I owned an NA, and then I've driven the current edition or the current iteration of that car, but it's been years. So to drive that car was really fun. We really had a great time when that, and I forgot what a terrific car it was. And then the thing that I didn't get a chance to drive that day, which arrived this week, was the Hyundai Ioniq 5N, which has kind of changed my life. I don't know how you guys feel about that thing, but man, oh man.
Right.
I haven't driven anything that felt that brutally fast. Like I could feel my eyeballs compress.
The first time I ever rode in a Tesla Model S, before it was Plaid, it was what were the other funny names for the high end? Ludicrous Speed.
Ludicrous Speed, yeah, right.
So I was in one of those a bunch of years back, and I used the term like partial retinal detachment.
Yeah, crazy,
right? Crazy. And so I haven't driven one of those. I've driven the regular Ioniq. I love the Ioniq because I love the design,
me too.
Right. Yep. So the design is inspired by like the Hyundai Pony, which was like one of the first cars in the US. That design was penned by Gregorio, who was the same person who did the Lamborghini Countach. So it's like the
Volkswagen Golf, by the way.
Yep.
Right.
So like there's a pedigree there, which is really cool.
For sure.
And like the automakers have taken different approaches to try and make EVs like sexy, quote unquote. Yeah. Maybe affix a name of a like famous car to like a Mustang to it. Right. Or a Blazer. There's a bunch of different things. Make it a cool, shape. This has been the right packaging because it's a car that doesn't have like the Denzians of purists that are going to be up in arms that it's an EV. It was a ubiquitous economy car that they've repurposed into something very cool.
Yeah, it totally doesn't make sense that it works the way it does, unless you kind of look at the cars of the 1980s. So like, Volkswagen Golf, Renault R5, the little Lancia, I can't remember what that one was, but like those cars were huge in Europe and they were big here too, so I really, like that car hits it for me. It's the right size. Like I'm an EV proponent, but these like enormous things, like I like, the Hummer EV was cool, but was like, man, this thing is enormous. It's 10,000 pounds. It takes forever to charge no matter where you charge it. And these things, they're smaller. They have smaller batteries. The charging rate is like 240 kilowatts. You can plug it into a level 3 charger and get 10 to 80% in 18 minutes, which is pretty insane. I just love their EV platform,
Well, and then there's like platform ubiquity. So like the Hummer EV, I laugh at because when I've driven it, I'm like, who is this for? Right? This is for somebody who is a Fortune 500 CEO who has a second home in Montana who wants a vehicle to leave there. They'll put a Stetson hat right on the driver's seat. Yeah. But that car, the Hummer EV, it's like a halo car. It's an engineering experiment. It also requires the same amount of lithium as like 4 Chevy Bolts, which is the part that kind of irks me, right? Right. With the Hyundai platform, that skateboard platform, you can use it for, the Ioniq, the Ioniq 6, the Kia EV6. Like there's a bunch
EV9.
Of
like it's It's like this small, medium, and large platform thing, which is literally a platform, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I remember going to I guess it was the Detroit Auto Show in like 2002, and GM showed their original kind of concept idea for this, which was an electric platform that it ended up being the Ultium platform, but generations later. But it was like, at the time, it was like, none of this makes any sense at all, and now it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, it does a lot for packaging too. So like you don't
Yeah.
have a transmission tunnel or a driveline tunnel, so you can the interior space. So even though like the Hyundai Ioniq 5 is visually a hatchback, it's classified as an SUV because it's one of these things where like when there's not enough details on it to really get a grasp of its size.
Yeah.
And it's about 20% bigger than your brain wants to think it is.
Right. Well, what's funny too is like I drove the Ioniq 5, the non-N version, and I liked it a lot. I thought it was great. Loved the styling. Doesn't look like anything else out there. It totally felt like, oh, this is the future. This feels like it must have been like looking at a, like a Frank Lloyd Wright building in 1938 or whatever. But the N is a whole different animal. It can be that economy, like really, efficient vehicle that the regular one is. But man, that N mode in it actually does something. And as my daughter, who's 20, is now fully obsessed with Formula One, she was like, this thing has DRS because it like literally has a boost button in it. Mm-hmm. and like it's only like it's like a 10-second boost, but it's insane. It's really wild. So yeah, I had a blast with that. Really enjoyed it. And I wouldn't have gotten in it if they hadn't sent it up for this event. I wouldn't have had a chance to get in it. So it's great that it's here. So Cliff, talk about a little bit about that event and the official winter vehicle that we just gave out a bunch of awards for. Talk about that too, because that was the other thing that we did, in July that ended up becoming, kind of a signature event for us.
Well, both of them typically were separated, like in years past, like when I started and when George started. But then, of course, when COVID hit, we had to really rearrange how we were doing things. We had a big event in May with MIT. We couldn't make that happen like we used to. So
yeah,
it's like how the Detroit Auto Show had to adapt and change. So did we. So did everybody. So we now have them together, like basically like two separate events, but in 2-day span.
Yep.
And truly doing the winter awards in summer. Initially, I was like, why? Why are we doing this? So what I said this year for dinner is just asking that exact question. And the answer is like, well, before we know it, it's winter. And we spend more time in the winter than in cold weather than we do in the beautiful time that it is now when we can have top ramble. So preparing the automakers for awards that they can use later in just a few short months is why we time it that way.
Yep.
And no other group does that. And our winter testing is such where it's like, we truly have to live that way. We don't have a choice. We are sometimes shoveling 2 feet up in Vermont. We're dealing with the slush and the mud. And it's like people in Michigan do that, but they've never done anything specifically with winter. Nowhere else in the country does it. So I think we're uniquely positioned on that front. And then separately, because we have the Ragtop Ramble the next day, it's like, it is like a night and day.
Everybody's in town. Yeah.
So it's interesting that we do it side by side like that, but we're dual focused. We're primarily focused on cold, but of course we want to have a good time in the summer, and that's why those cars exist. So I think we know the seasons better than anybody. I'm biased, but truly, like, we go through extremes, and we don't live in perfect conditions year round. And I think that's where most people live. They're not in a perfect world. They're not enjoying that constantly if they're not in Southern California, right? Like we're more representative of how actual people drive.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Is like people ask like me how I do my evaluations. Aside from doing like a certain loop that I might do for fuel economy and take some notes on that, I'm just living with the vehicle. And that's
Right.
because that's how 99% of the owners are living with it. If I get a sports car, yes, I'm going to put it through its paces and review on that. But really, I'm going and getting groceries, and I'm going
Right.
to just do the things that I usually do with it, because evaluating in that sense, because that's what most people, once you get over the novelty of the acceleration or the fact that it's electric, or the fact that it has a removable roof if it's a Jeep, once you get over those things, it all comes down to, well, can I fit kid seats in there?
Can I live with this? Yeah.
In there? Does it family? Does it road trip? All these sorts of things. And so, like, for example, I just got out of the Rolls-Royce Spectre and was like,
which is something that many normal people say on, that's a phrase you're going to hear 10, 12 times a day, George.
But I'm not driving to like, I'm not driving through, to a mansion and parking up and be like, well, does it mansion? Does it do the normal daily things, right?
Right. Yeah, I remember actually having a Bentley and going to get like pool supplies with it. Going to Ocean State Job Lot.
Yeah. Well, it was the Rolls-Royce Spectre, so the first ever electric Rolls-Royce. So I had to go. I was charging it, and there's some around here in Providence, but I was on my way up to my parents' house, so I stopped at like a Target off of 495, and it was funny. I'm like, well, I'm here for about 30 minutes. Why don't I do some shopping? So like, here I am walking with a couple bags like Target, kitchen supplies.
Yeah, because you want to save the money,
Yeah. How do you think it got that way? Like, it's pinching pennies, tipping with buttons.
So we should talk a little bit about like how, like the timing of the way we do winter vehicle testing too, because we do similar to the Ragtop Ramble. We get together for one day in February where we all kind of, do our final judging, but we're actually asking for those cars that are going to be nominated in November, December, because we're going to drive them all winter. And for me, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but that one day is the day where I show up and drive things that I haven't driven before. Like I can't get into everything, but they're all there. So if I can get, a half an hour in something just to kind of see how it operates, then that's what I use that day for.
Yeah, it refreshes your memory for sure. And it's good for, cross comparisons and all the talking that we do. We know how to talk and criticize and have all these opinions. And that's honestly my favorite part of it, because it's sometimes like, oh, didn't expect.
Well, so have you had your mind changed at that event? Because I definitely have.
In the past too, it made me think like, oh, like, you can put a snowplow on trucks. Like Ezra Dyer came one year and I think he was plowing some guy's cranberry field, like,
with a G-Wagon, if I remember correctly, right? Yeah.
So it's like stuff like that. It's like, oh, there's a lot of different perspectives, and we all come from so many different areas, and like it's that one time when we can be like break bread literally and just like, okay, like what do you really think? No one else is around but us, and it's like this honest discussion happening. And then winter is obviously continuing. We're still tabulating awards and votes, the votes specifically, because not everyone is there. Where you got to give everybody a chance, and then before you know it, here we are again. And then the cycle continues.
Right.
And you can't guarantee snow that day either, right?
No.
We've had it when it's been like 65 that day. We've had it when it's been like a nor'easter.
We've had to cancel.
That speaks to the frantic nature of New England weather. But I think another argument for like the summer testing is, or the summer presentation is that like now you get to see our roads with like no snow on it. You can see just how craggly some of these back roads are.
Oh yeah,
in all of their glory, right?
Yeah, and like it's since 2016 or so, which was when we got in the Boston area, absolutely pounded, like legendary snow that year. We really haven't had in the Boston area a winter like that since then. It's gotten noticeably warmer. We definitely noticed that the lakes and stuff around here that used to freeze 10, 15 years ago are not freezing on a regular basis. But if you go 30 miles north of here, or 50 miles north of here, once you get into, New Hampshire, Southern Maine, north of Portland, where a lot of our members, live. It's a whole different climate up there. And, lakes freeze on the regular every winter, and they get brutal snow. And their road conditions in some of these places are deplorable. So, it's like a whole package of what we offer as New England people that, to all my, with all due respect to people in, Southern California and Texas and all of the other places in the country that do this, they don't experience that. They have a totally different experience. So, their experience is totally valid, but I think we bring something to the table that a lot of regions don't. Right.
And as our fleet becomes more and more electrified, like in Rhode Island, there's really good infrastructure for EVs. But I know from talking to our members that are in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, that's not the case. And so if, you can say, well, oh, New England's better for EVs, yada, yada, yada. It's like, well, no, some of our members are dealing with the same struggles that somebody in Ohio might be dealing with in terms of EV infrastructure.
Right. And so that's an interesting point. Like, I know Southern Maine, because I spent a lot of time in the Portland area. Like, the coverage is pretty good there. It's actually really good. It's as good as it is here. But once you get north of that, it's a different ball game. But on the flip side of that, Maine has cleaner energy than anywhere in the country, right? So they get 0% of their electricity from coal. They don't do much with petrochemicals. They it's some natural gas, but a lot of hydropower, a lot of wind power and solar up there. So it's like a whole different picture. So when you're a Maine automotive writer and you're talking to your people locally, that's something that you get to talk about. That's completely unique. It's completely unique in the country. It's not something that somebody in West Virginia is going to experience. Go ahead, Cliff.
I was going to say, with regard to EVs, like, we've seen just how range is impacted and how different cars are better. I remember when a few years ago, the Jaguar I-Pace came out, and I remember trying to get to John Lawler's garage. I couldn't. It was only 150 miles, but it was fully charged, super cold day. I found out later that there was a thing called a heat pump. And I was like, oh, okay. A Hyundai EV, Kia EVs had them. I'm just using them as examples. And I was like, oh, what is that? It drove so much further because it was more efficient at distributing heat. Whereas, like, the Jaguar and a lot of others in that space, when they first came out, were all resistive heaters like you'd have in your basement, where you're cranking up the electric heat and it zapped the battery. So you're just like, we know that from just our own experience, where it's like someone else might not even care if the car had that in another region. But it's like, for us, it's like, this is a huge deal. And that's why we also test and always make sure to point out those features, because it's not just all-wheel drive, right? Like, we don't need to have all-wheel drive on necessarily every car. But like something like that, it's like, people need
that's mandatory.
Right. So it makes a big difference, and we only find that out by testing.
I remember that first wave of EVs, the Nissan Leaf, the Kia Soul EV, and the Volkswagen e-Golf. They kind of all, the Leaf was there early, but the other two followed really quickly behind. Oh, and the Fiat 500e. And they were all like 100-mile range EVs. And exactly what you said, you turn the heat on and the range would go down to 75 miles. And it was like, on the one hand, like, this isn't really usable for most people. 75 miles isn't going to cut it. On the other hand, what it did do was present to me like how different the experience of driving an EV is, where, if you had an economy car before, it had a buzzy 4-cylinder in it, kind of noisy, not all that pleasant. And I got in the Leaf, it was like, wow, this feels like a premium experience in here, just because that engine isn't buzzing away. So it's like, it's a whole, like, we get to evaluate a lot of things in a lot of different ways. And I think that's exactly one of those things where, we had to, it felt like the demand for something that offered more than 100 miles kind of came from places where the weather is exactly the way it is here. That's going to be true that might be true in April. That might be true in May here, you know, because it's still cold. It's still cold around here.
Have either of you experienced, like I'll often get sort of anecdotal feedback from friends and family about certain vehicles. I'll take them for a ride, get that feedback. I'll often incorporate that in my notes because we might, as observers, be too close to the product or be too familiar with it, right?
Right.
Have you ever experienced a situation by which a journalist or a bunch of journalists have critiqued a vehicle or offered up some sort of feedback that the automakers have responded to?
Let me see. Well, I'll give you a good example. And this is from a long time ago. But John White, who I referred to, who used to be the automotive writer at the Boston Globe for many years, who actually a lot of people were fans of like writers in Car and Driver and Road and Track. When I was 12, 13 years old, I wanted to be John White because I read his column religiously every weekend. And at the time, GM was offering passive restraints. So there was a lot of different, it was like the Wild West of safety, right? Some cars had an airbag, some cars had an automatic seatbelt that like went on a track on the door frame. And then GM's thing was they were going to attach the seatbelt to the door. So when you opened the door, the seatbelt was actually attached to the door. And a state trooper in Maine was killed when his car was hit and the door came open and he came right out of the car. And there was John, that was right or wrong. That was John's campaign for about a year, that he was going to he was going to let GM know that this was a safety issue. And it might've been one thing. It might've been one car, but that was his thing. That was his advocacy for that period of time. And they eventually kind of moved away from that design. And whether or not it was John, who knows, but they were getting press in one of the largest, most popular newspapers in the entire country. That was, for a small market in Boston, there's 6 million people in Massachusetts, however many people in New England, 10 million. It's not a very big market, but it's very powerful. That paper had circulation all over the country. So that is the one example I can come up with off the top of my head where, yeah, I think we had some influence over that.
And I know that, let's say like a Car and Driver Road and Track, like there is definitely like almost direct lines of communication.
Sure. Right.
So things might, come in terms of feedback. I have to wonder if, like, say around 2013, Honda on the Civic had like instead of a volume dial, had like a little like touch capacitive finger drag thing. Yeah. And after like much consternation from basically the entire automotive press, they finally put a dial on, and it was like the smallest dial ever, like from the
it was like kind of I know it was like a Tic Tac.
Yeah, it was like a big middle finger from the engineers. Right? Like fine, right?
Yeah.
So that was something that was positive. I also think it can cut the other way. So for example, like for a long time, Lexus, a lot of journalists were saying these cars are too soft. They're sort of more older. They're not as exciting. You should be going after BMW. And then they did. And then they got this really aggressive styling, firmer rides.
Yep.
And I think as a result, it's almost out of sync with like what buyers are expecting for a vehicle like that. Like for the IS, the small sedan, yes, like a dynamic vehicle, but like the ES doesn't have to be those things. The ES
right.
LS can be more refined. It doesn't need a big grille or angry headlights. So like us wanting to sports car everything can cut both ways, right?
For sure. Yeah.
I do like the fact that, good automakers tend to listen, not just to customers, but to the media, and they're open to doing it. Some car makers that aren't tend to be German. I've been in so many interviews where you just will talk to somebody and be like, so, the steering is not really as, organic feeling as it was before, and the answer you get is like, well, we met the technical specification.
Right.
It's like, okay, but
right.
Most buyers that I'm talking to in our region and nationally are really experiencing the same thing. And it's just like, no, we know better than you. And that attitude definitely causes some divisive relations between, say, press and the automakers. But the ones that can truly take honest feedback and be like, all right, I don't really like that headline, I didn't like what you said, but you weren't lying. I'm not going to come after you, and like, I'm going to listen. And that truly is like the relationships that I try to cultivate. And if that doesn't work, I think you have to always defend your stance, right? I think as journalists, we have to be
I think to George's point that, you know, with Lexus too, you know, the touchpad that I can't remember what they called that thing.
Remote touch.
It was like, it was unusable. And it was especially unusable here where you might be getting into a car with gloves on. Right. Yeah. So it was like, it just made it completely unusable. You know, all the infotainment stuff, you know, you basically couldn't use it. It was very frustrating. And they invested a ton of money and investment in time in developing that. And they eventually, it took a while, but they took the feedback and really kind of like, all right, you know, we get it. And it seems like it's better now. You know?
That's one of the tough things with like developing a car. And that is like, from what I've learned from the automakers, like they do the tech last because it evolves so quickly. But the problem is that when when it's not about the hardware or the advancement of the software, it's about like your philosophy with how it's supposed to interact with the consumer. For example, instead of just holding out like a placeholder for a touchscreen right before you go to production, you develop the entire center console around like a touch controller. I know like Honda still has that, but Honda Acura, and they're slowly making their way out of that. So if you look at the new Integra, it's got a touchscreen. And if you look, a lot of the automakers are kind of abandoning certain decisions and just going with the touchscreen because it's what people understand. Then that kind of opens up the center console again. Depending on what automaker it is, they're not making the best decisions with how they use the center console. Like maybe more real estate than should be to like a giant drive mode controller, right? Or a button or rotary shifter, right? Like just things that might be out of sync with where people are, just for the point of like, we need to differentiate ourselves.
Right.
And Craig, look what happened years ago with Ford and, you know, with my Ford Touch. Like, you know, you were brutally honest about that, right?
Oh man.
Things that, you know, people didn't want to hear, but they did listen, and
they fixed it.
Ford actually, I think, for a period of time, banned you from press cars in the area because they were so mad. And they were
really upset. So little backstory on that. We used to go to IMPA Test Day all the time. It's the International Motor Press Association. And we got down there, we're on the track. And I said to Cliff, like, maybe you were videoing, you were doing a lot more video content. You said, well, let's take a run around in this and we'll kind of, you know, see what you think and we'll do something with it. And we said, well, why don't we talk about the sync system? I think it was the first one, right?
Yep.
It was unusable. It wouldn't do anything. And, you know, like it was the most incredibly frustrating thing as a vehicle driver to try to operate. And we, you know, put a maybe 2-minute video together and it exploded. And I think they were hanging my picture in Ford headquarters for a little while. But you know, it was like I think you responded to that. Like, look, you know, you can't dispute what this experience was. Exactly. It was not good. And it just improved with every generation, and now completely usable system. But you're right. Like there's a lot of things. I was thinking about this, like as George was talking, there were a lot of things that, like, has anybody driven this car? You know, like things get released and you think to yourself, like, I can't believe that anybody drove this around and thought this is acceptable. You know, I do think that like, you know, people always ask me like, what's the most reliable car, unreliable? It almost doesn't matter. Right. Cars mechanically are pretty good now. They didn't used to be pretty good. They're much more pretty good than they used to be, but the tech is awful. It can be really, really bad, or it can be really good. And that's reflected in things like JD Power Scores, where every single year they're getting hammered for like things like Bluetooth integration. Like we've had this for a long time now. So like, you know, how have we not figured this out? So what are the things that you're most frustrated with now?
For me, I think it's just like what George was saying, like just changing basic controls into
Yeah.
something very unintuitive, and it's like it becomes a safety thing. I mean,
Yeah.
Hyundai's done the same thing with like changing their gear selectors and making it like a column shifter, but it's not a column shifter. And
Yeah,
so
I know.
every time I'm in a new car, it's like I've been driving for so long, like I know how to drive, but I feel like I don't
Right.
for like a brief time, and it's like this shouldn't
Yeah, the
be
dials that were there for a while, you know, it's
Yeah.
like, what are we doing?
So I just a really quick thing on that, and I think I've shared this story before, and it's kind of maddening. Is when BMW maybe first started going into its own unique type of shifter, I asked somebody from BMW like, why, right?
Yep.
And this was their response was, this creates a secret handshake with the driver that only the driver knows. So it creates an air of exclusivity. So when when Aunt Gladys has to borrow the car, she feels more poor. Essentially, I'm translating that she doesn't have a BMW and doesn't know how it works.
Right.
It's like trying to get in and be like, oh, you don't know how to operate a Learjet, right? So,
That's good. Which is what you want in an automobile, right?
Right.
You know,
so because everybody copies luxury. That has trickled down. That's matriculated its way down from the luxury brands to non-luxury brand. And yeah, it's maddening. I think it's a safety thing. I think you should, by and large, be able to get into a car and operate it with one of three different, like a column shifter, a floor shifter, or some other sort of like. Even the dial in Chrysler vehicles or Stellantis vehicles,
the push button that was in Ford stuff for a while.
That was at least there was like a linear sense to it, right? So like the turn on the Hyundai thing is a little confusing because you don't know if you're going to be in forward or reverse, because if, with reverse you pull back on the conventional shifter too. So it's like this is unnecessary, and I think there's a lot of solutioning for things that nobody asked for, because to your point, cars have gotten so good, they go, okay, we're kind of at peak car, right? From a UI UX standpoint, they go, well, how do we iterate? How do we improve? And I think the next generation is going to be, I don't want to say like jitterbugging cars, right? But like dumbing them down.
Yeah. Yeah. We don't need the Acura shifter that looks like, some kind of a play school, logic test for kids, like, what am I supposed to do with this thing?
Right.
Well, listen, I've kept you guys for an hour. I really appreciate you doing this. You're going to see, thanks for everybody who's watching this. We're planning on doing this once a month or so. And George and I are going to be here. Cliff is going to come back from time to time. We're going to have some great guests. We're going to have some industry people, some of our own members. So like and subscribe, as the kids say, and we will see you the next time.
Great. Take care.